Okay, so after a break of a week, and thank you for everybody who really participated and made it a very special event for all of us. Big Kiddush Hashem. We are up to Daf Lamed Ches on the days, Lamed Ches on the days, and we stopped a couple of weeks ago at the two dots. The two dots are about 6 or 7 lines from the top. So we're starting with Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer. And just to refresh our recollection, on Lamed Ches Amud Aleph, in the Mishnah, we went through some very interesting discussions. But the basic machlokes between the Tana Kama and Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is whether or not if you give payers, something that is fungible, to someone to hold, and those payers start deteriorating, whether or not the damage that can be done to those payers, to those fruits, can be sort of ameliorated by quickly selling it and keeping the money for the owner, so that there shouldn't be a bigger loss than what's already happening. So we had a fascinating discussion for a couple of weeks as we went through the understanding of what it means. And just to review, the Tana Kama says no, under no circumstance may you sell those products. You basically have to watch it deteriorate. And the Gemara gave 2 basic reasons. One was Rav Kana's reason that a person wants his own rather than much more kav shalom metisha kav shel chavero. So in other words, even though his is going to deteriorate, he'd rather have his than someone else's, meaning the money that he would get to buy something from off the shelf. And then the second one, which was a little bit more complicated but had a lot more ramification, had to do with trumas and maasros, is that if you sell it, then you jeopardize the possibility that the owner can give truma or maaser from that produce for produce he owns somewhere else. And that raised all kinds of different questions, which we're not going to review again. But in other words, those are 2 reasons why the Tana Kama said you may not sell it, because you have to preserve it for the owner. Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says, no, across the board you can sell it. Why? Because it's Meshev Aveda. And remember that one of the principles that governs us generally, and specifically when we learn the Gemara, is that people are very mindful of the ownership of property belonging to someone else, and therefore, if they see another Yid's property being destroyed, they want to try to prevent it. So here they see that the produce is about to deteriorate. So Shimon Gamliel says, no, you can go ahead and sell it without the owner's permission, because inherently the owner would want you to sell it in order to preserve his product. Again, the Gemara went through a discussion about whether the deterioration was normal or more than the normal deterioration which happens, which we're going to learn in the Gemara in the next block. We're going to see that every food or every product is fungible to a certain degree, but that's okay. In other words, if you lose 5%, 6, 10%, whatever it is, that's not unusual. But the kasha was whether or not it started deteriorating to the point of 20, 30, 40%, whether that made it more urgent or to sell. Anyway, but Rabbi Shimon Gamliel's point is you sell in order to preserve. That's what our Gemara now is going to discuss, is what does that mean? Says the Gemara on Lamed Ches Amud Days, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer, Machrim bebezdin b'pnei shehu k'meishav labali. That you do sell the produce, and again, it's not adulterated here by whether you sell it early or late, whether it's within the norm of deterioration or not. But he makes a general statement. The Gemara later, of course, goes into, and we're going to discuss it now. But the question is, what is it? So, in other words, you can sell in order to be Meshev Aved. So now says the Gemara, Itma Rab Abba Rab Yaakov Omer Rab Yochanan. So this is interesting because we're going to see how the Gemara views this particular principle of Shimon Gamliel. Rab Abba Rab Yaakov Omer Rab Yochanan says in the name of Yochanan, Halachas Rab Shimon Gamliel. the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, meaning that you allow a person to sell, because if he sells, then he's Meshav Aveda. Okay, so that's step one. Okay, now comes Amar Rav Nachman, says Rav Nachman. So first it was Rabbi Yaakov Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Now Rava Amar Rav Nachman. Rava says in the name of Rav Nachman, halacha kedivrei chachamim. Rava argues, and he says the halacha is kedivrei chachamim. So in other words, we have a machlekes amoraim on whether or not the Tanna Kama here is not Rav Meir, as is often the case. It's the Rabbanan. So the Rabbanan are the Tanna Kama, and they're the ones who say that you may not sell it. And Rava says that's the halacha. Rabbi Yochanan says the halacha is to Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. Frek the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan, that same Rabbi Yochanan, who says the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, Choda Zimna, he said one time, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan, Kol Makom Sheshana, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, B'Mishna halacha kamoso. So wait a minute, you're telling me that the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. What? That's a big chiddush. We see that Rabbi says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, it says anywhere in Shas, Kol Makom Sheshana, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, B'Mishna wherever Rabbi Shimon Gamliel appears, it means if he is a Baal Machlokes, if he is one of the Manda Omrim in that Mishnah, halacha kamoso, the halacha is like him, chutz, except for, there's a couple of exceptions which aren't really relevant to us, but me'orev, and there's a case, I think in Gemara Gittin, that talks about an orev, about Babasra, that says Rashi, orev, that it's referring to a get, that the halacha is not like him, B'tzidon, and also the Maseches Gittin, there is where a get was transferred from one place to Tzidon, all right? V'raya achrina, and also in the case of, says Rashi, Bedine Mamanis Hasheni, there's two cases of Dine Mamanis in Sanhedrin, Shenechachlu B'shnei Machlotis, maybe Shtar Raya Listers Hadin. Can you bring a Shtar Raya? In other words, if the Bezdin Paskin, and you brought a written document which is opposite or opposed to the din. Now, the Bezdin gave a halacha, but then you bring a document that Beferish shows that the din wasn't correct. Barishona halacha kamoso. So in the two cases in Sanhedrin, in the first one, the halacha was like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, Uba'achrona ein halacha kamoso. But in the second case, it was not. So it's not relevant here, but the point is that these are three exceptions to the general rule. What's the general rule? Wherever Rabbi Shimon Gamliel weighs in a machlokes, the halacha is like him. So the kasha is, what's the point? Why do we even mention it in our Mishnah? Why does Rabbi Yochanan say the halacha Rabbi Shimon Gamliel as if that's a chiddush? That's universally accepted that the halacha is Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, except in three instances. So in other words, what are you gaining by telling us halacha Rabbi Shimon Gamliel? In this case, when the Gemara generally lets us know it's always like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, except in cases which aren't relevant here. So that's the kasha of the Gemara. And we see this in other places in the Gemara, and we're going to see it again a little bit later, is if the Gemara makes a general statement in one direction and then makes a specific statement in the same direction, the kasha always is, what do you need that second statement for? The first statement covers the entire process. So here the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel across Shas, except for three cases. And you're telling me a chiddush that in this particular case, the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. Of course it is. That's the kasha. So in other words, okay, so that's the kasha of the Gemara. Again, we're trying to dissect and understand when the Gemara emphasizes these kind of points. Now remember that the Seder of the Gemara, after Rabbi Yehuda Nasi did the Mishnah, there was a lot of shaklavataria. There was a lot of discussion between Amoraim back and forth. What we see in our Gemara is only a small part of that shaklavataria. There's so much more, which again isn't sort of published. It isn't in our Gemara, but was the Torah Sheba'al Peh going back and forth between the Amoraim. They just codified a portion of it. So this is a highlight, but it's a major highlight because it tells us that Rabbi Shimon Gamliel was so well respected that when he made a psak halacha or when he said something, it was universally accepted. So why? What's the chiddush? Why does the Gemara have to choose special words to tell us that Rabbi Yochanan says the halacha is Rabbi Yochanan? Of course it is. It always is. So that's the thinking here of the Gemara. Why the Gemara even mentions this? So what's the point? And for the Gemara. So the Gemara says, Amoy Roy Ninu, you're right. It is not a chiddush in and of itself, but Amaroy Ninu, it's a machloikis Amaroim, and that's why it's mentioned in the Gemara. What's the machloikis Amaroim, says Rashi? Rabba Amma Bichlala, as a klal, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Abba Amma Lav Bichlala. So the machloikis Amaroim is whether or not Rabbi Yochanan's statement is accepted by everybody. Rabbi Yochanan makes the statement that the halacha is Rabbi Shimon Gamliel except for. So Rashi says, "B'chlala Amar Rabbi Yochanan." Rav Abba, who is the other person who is making a statement here, says, "Lav b'chlala Amar Rabbi Yochanan." Yesh mem shehalacha kamosa. In other words, it's not so general. It's not so well accepted that Rabbi Yochanan's position of halacha Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is well accepted. So you see that the Amoraim, those who came after the Machlokes, not everybody held that Rabbi Shimon Gamliel was the Rashka Bahag, that he was the final word, the final incisor. Some said, yeah, okay, I'll accept Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. Others said, yeah, well, it depends on what the circumstance. So again, the Gemara is just showing us that there wasn't unanimity in whether or not Rabbi Shimon Gamliel was the sort of the paisik that everybody followed. And we see that even in our time. Jay, I know you like to draw to present day events, but we see, so in some cases, everybody holds that there's a certain paisik that everybody holds up. And then in other cases, you see that people say, we're not so fast. There's other piskei halacha, and we're not going to accept the words, and I don't want to particularize who we're talking about because you can insert different names, but certainly of the Gedolim that we know in the last 50 years in our time, there wasn't always unanimity in whether or not a particular Gadol, let's say, was the final word. There were others who of importance. There were others who said, no, we have different psak. But this is how the Gemara is answering it, that Amoraim. It's machlokes Amoraim whether Rabbi Yochanan is correct that Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is the major paisik of the time, and everything is like it. Okay, so that's kind of how the Gemara is answering that. Amoraim va'alibed Rabbi Yochanan, and in other words, Amoraim va'alibed Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, so now having said that, the Gemara now wants to take Rabbi Shimon Gamliel's psak and wants to basically tell us that from that psak we can learn out something else that is totally not related, just totally not related to his psak, but because of his psak, we now learn something else. What do we learn? Says the Gemara, Mid Rabbi Shimon Gamliel nishma, from the words of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, who says that basically you can sell it to protect Shabbos Aveda, we learn the Moridin Korov V'Nichsei Shavui. So here we have a different discussion. So there's a brisa that tells us that if someone is in captivity, and the brisa there refers to captivity, but the Mefarshim, as we'll see, enlarge that to not necessarily captivity. Remember, in those days, if a person wanted to go from point A to point B, he had to go on a ship, and he might have been on the high seas for 6 months, and he may have been until he gets like Eretz Yisrael. It could take maybe who knows how long to get there, and that same amount of time to come back. So basically, his nechasim are unprotected. So the Gemara talks about a captive, someone who's in prison, but it doesn't mean specifically that. It means someone who just isn't around to give a directive. So says the Gemara, from the words of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, Nishma, the Moridin Karav V'Nichsei Shavui. If let's say a person is not around, okay, he's in captivity, and he has a big field, and that field has produce, and that produce, like everything else we talked about, is starting to deteriorate because that's the natural state of affairs. So the question is, what do you do with that produce? Says the Gemara, based on Rav Shimon Gamliel, I make the following hypothesis, that you insert a karov, a relative, into the property. Why? Because the thinking is that the relative will have a vested interest in making sure that the produce is not destroyed, or that the whole thing doesn't sort of get destroyed, and therefore it's smart to put in a relative. Okay, the aim so midrabanan. Now that's what Shimon Gamliel. What do the Rabbanan do? The Rabbanan argue and say you can't touch this produce, not allowed. So from the Rabbanan nishma the aim we can cover the shavut. So from the Tanakama we have to say, we have to extrapolate that you can't install a karev. Why? Because they say you may not sell it. So because they say you may not sell it, then if inserting a karev is supposed to be a positive thing for the land, in other words, protection, you're not allowed to do it because the Rabbanan say you can't sell anything. You have to let it go fallow. So you have to derive from that you're not allowed to put a karev, because what's the point? The whole point of the karev is to protect. And since you're not allowed to protect, don't put them in. What's the point of putting in? So, in other words, based on what we're hypothecating Rabbi Shimon Gamliel means, we're saying the Rabbanan has to say the opposite.
Excuse me.
Why do you have to say that? Why do you have to say that the Rabbanan are opposed to putting in a karev? Mela, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel puts in a karev because the karev has a vested interest in the property, and the property is deteriorating, and this fellow is now far away or in prison. That's why I understand. You take a karev, someone who has an interest in seeing that the land is not destroyed, and you put him in. But the opposite, why is the opposite true? Why do you automatically say that because the Rabbanan say you may not sell, that you shouldn't put in a karev? Maybe you can put in a karev anyway. So that's a frankly, how do you know? Jay, you had a question?
Yes, I have never heard of the notion of putting a karev into any situation per se in the Gemara. It's probably just my shortfalls. But why would they even think of why would they say there's a legal basis to ask that kind of question? What's the foundation of the question such that a karev would have a chance of? In other words, what made it a good question in terms of the background?
Okay, so that's a valid point, and the answer, at least from where we sit right now, and that you hit on a question that may have some validity exactly the way you're asking. You're asking where do you come? What's the point of a karev, right? In other words, where's the basis of putting in a karev in this particular situation? So the hava amina of the Gemara is that of all the people in the world that can take care of a piece of property, who would you think would be the best person to put in? You can hire somebody and pay him, right? Or you can say a karev who. So listen to this. He is an inheritor. You take a karev, you put him into the property, and if something happens to that owner of that property, that's the fellow who will inherit the property. So does he have a vested interest in seeing that the property is properly maintained? Of course he does. Because ultimately, at some point in time, he will own it. So the Gemara has a havamina that you take a karev who has a vested interest in the future, even though today he's not an owner, and you put him in because he'll preserve what will ultimately be his.
So what they mean, so it has to be a karev who has the potential to inherit, not just a cousin who won't inherit.
Correct. And that's how Rashi puts it. So let's take a look. Exactly those words. Midrab Shimon Nishma the Moridin Karov, says Rashi, Horoi Liyoresh. You put in a Karov, not a 10th cousin, but someone who will be in line to inherit. Right away, you see that that person is the right person because he's going to protect the land. Contra Shimon Gamliel, you protect the land because it's a Shabbos Aveda. Who better to protect the land than a Yerush? Someone who is going to have a vested interest in the land, not just, as the Gemara will say later, he's a sharecropper, he gets paid like everybody else to just maintain. No, this is someone who has a real interest.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's Pshat Rav Shimon Gamliel. But the Gemara Umimai, how do you know that the Rabbanan take an opposing view here? This is the question. Why? Dilma Atka. Now, so we have two cases: the case of our Mishnah and the case of the Brisa of the captive. Those are two different cases. So now, Dilma Atkan Lo Kam Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Hacha. Maybe Rabbi Shimon Gamliel in our case, meaning our Mishnah, Elam Mishum de Kokalya Karna. Do you know why Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says that you have to sell it and preserve the Kokalya Karna because the principle, the actual land is going to get destroyed. And if the land gets destroyed, then there will not be the potential of Hashavas Haveda, which is Rabbi Gamliel's underlying basis. Hashavas Haveda, you have to preserve the guy's land. So if the whole land can possibly be destroyed, that's why Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says in our Mishnah that you have to do it. Aval Hossam, but in the case of the captive, no, you can't go down and protect. There is no possibility, because in that case, we were talking about minimal damage, not maximal damage. In the case of maximum damage, our Mishnah, where the whole thing can be destroyed or 80-90%, we see Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, of course you can go in and protect. But in the case of the shavui, of the captive, or the person who's not there, I'm not going to allow it. In other words, this is now the Gemara already saying, don't assume that Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says in all cases it's the same. And the flip is the assumption with the Rabbanan. And the Rabbanan say here, Hacha, you know why they say you may not touch it? Because we had two views which we just repeated. Rav Kana says, or Rab Nachman by Yitzchak, who says for Trumas and Masras. That's why the Rabbanan in our Mishnah say you may not sell it because you have two very valid reasons not to sell it. Aval Hossam, in the case of the Shavui, we're not worried about Kav Shalom, V'tisha Kavim. We're not worried about those issues. So maybe the Rabbanan would say, you know what? Go ahead and sell it. So the Gemara's kasha is you automatically assume that the Rabbanan, the Tanakama, were opposed in the case of Shavui to what Rav Shimon Gamliel was saying. Says the Gemara, don't make that assumption. I can completely distinguish our case of our Mishnah with the case of Shavui, because our Mishnah is dealing with almost total destruction, potential almost destruction, not the case there. And that case over there has nothing to do with Rav Kana and Rav Nachman Yitzchak, where we're gonna protect it because he's going to give Truma Masa or something like that. So in other words, each one has its own basis. Don't assume one over the other. So the kasha is on the Rabbanan where you extrapolated and said the Rabbanan have to say that arguing with Rav Shimon Gamliel, Nimai. How do you know in the case of Shavui that they would argue? And we see this again, time and again in the Gemara. The Gemara is trying to put a wedge in between the two and saying you can't compare our Mishnah, which is one set of facts, to the case of Shavui, which is another set of facts, right? And Rashi says, right away, our Mishnah is speaking about total destruction. In Yanichim Sham, if you leave it there, then it'll be destroyed. But in the case of the Shavui, okay, there'll be a little bit of destruction. But we all agree, we've seen this from our previous learning, a little bit of destruction is okay because that's normal. So in the case of normal destruction, maybe the rabbis would admit to Rav Shimon Gamliel that Gamliel would admit to the rabbis, you know what? You can't sell it. There's nothing going on here. But in the case of major destruction, the Rabbanan would agree. So, in other words, sitting there, these Amoraim are trying to sort of squeeze out a theory of why the rabbis would be totally opposed and be consistent in their view in the case of Shavui. And the answer is you can't. You can't find the same reason why the Chacham and the Tanakama say no to one and not to the other. There's two, because they're two distinguished cases. So that's what Rashi's saying. Where do you make the comparison, right?
Rabbi, I mean, there's a total lack of parallelism from the other sugya from which we're trying to derive something. The man made a deliberate deposit of his field or his produce with somebody else. He told somebody to take care of it. Here in today's, this is not anticipated at all. The guy went on a long trip. He may or may not have done
had said anything, right?
Yeah, but the guy who was taken captive, he wasn't anticipating that.
Right.
So there's no deliberate saying, here, you take care of this stuff for me. It's not.
That's
no,
right.
No shomer. No shomer in this case.
No shomer. And again, the Gemara is going to hit on that point, David, in a minute. But you're right. So in other words, they're not at all comparable for you to deduce and say that the machlokes in our Mishnah would carry over to the machlokes in the case of Shavui, because there are different circumstances, right? And Rashi elaborates and says, Ikar of Nachman Ikar of Kana. Remember that our Mishnah is guided by the interpretation of Rav Kana, the Omalel Rote Odom the Kav Shalo. That case in Shavui has nothing to do with those principles. So once again, in other words, the point is, if you can't make a real comparison on all fours, as we like to say, that this is the same as this, and here's the reason, then you can't extrapolate that the machlokes carries over, because there could be, as you point out, many differences. In one case, he wants the guy to be involved. In another case, he has no intention for the guy to be involved. So,
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Two things. The first is, if he's going away on a trip or whatever he's going away for, wouldn't one think that, one, if he doesn't realize how long he may be, and he figures if I'm going for a month, it could sit dormant. But if he was aware that he's going away for longer, he may have a family in the house, he may have children, his wife. They've got to live somehow, and that was their subsistence.
Right.
So if he's looking at a short term, I'm just going to go away for a month, well, okay, I can come back and then I can take care of things. If he, for whatever reason may be, he's captured, or there's a delay or whatever, he can't get back in time, what the Bezdin is doing by letting him have a member of the family, one, he could support the family. Otherwise, how are the people going to live? If the produce is damaged, they all lose. If the field sits over a period of time, they have to be recultivated and you have to put all the nutrients back in and everything.
Right.
So it behooves him or the court to allow somebody to do it, take over the responsibility, feed the family, do whatever they have to, protect the property. So when that person comes back, the owner, he has somebody to take it over with. Who better is it than a member of the family who's up for?
And that's exactly what this discussion on machlokes is about, is what you just said. In the case of the Shavui, and David made a good point, because in the case of the Mishnah, there was a directive to a shomer, don't do anything, or do something. In other words, there was spoken out directive, and so the Rabbanan says, since the directive was don't touch it, don't touch it. And Rabbi Gamliel says, no, you always have to protect the integrity of the property for the owner. In the case of the Shavui, exactly as you just said, David, there was no discussion. The guy was picked up by the authorities, or he picked himself up and went on a trip and didn't enunciate and didn't leave a shtar or some directive for people to take care of his property. So the Gemara is extrapolating and thinking, okay, the case of the Shavui, how is it like or not like the case of our Mishnah? And that's where the machlokes comes in, and where the Gemara says, maybe it's not a machlokes at all. Maybe in the case of the Shavui, David, as you just said, those extenuating circumstances would allow the Rabbanan to say, yes, take care of it. Or maybe Rabbi Gamliel would say, no, don't take care of it, because in that particular case, it's not going to affect the whole property. That's the essence of this discussion, is since the Mishnah in Shavui is silent on the directive of what to do, the question is Rav Shimon Gamliel L'shitaso saying the same thing he says in the Mishnah? And is the rabbi saying the same thing that they say in the Mishnah, meaning you can't touch it? Or do we cross over and say, no, the rabbis say that in the case of the Mishnah, you can't. But in our case, of course you can. And vice versa with Rav Shimon Gamliel. In the case of the Mishnah, of course you can. But here, you can't because there was no directive, or the property is not in complete jeopardy. Again, it could have been a property that did not have the potential of deterioration beyond just a moderate amount. So in other words, these are the open-ended questions that cause this machlokes to be unclear. What does Rav Shimon Gamliel hold in the case of Shavui? Is it different than the Mishnah? And the same with the rabbis. So we wanted to say that the rabbis automatically argue on Rav Shimon Gamliel and say that you can't sell it. Says the Gemara, how do you know? Maybe in the case of the Mishnah, of course you can't, because there was a directive and because you don't touch it. But in the case of the Shavui, he would allow, and vice versa with Rav Shimon Gamliel. So again, the Gemara is trying to make us open our minds to think of all the possibilities. The simple thing is to say, Rav Shimon Gamliel always says what he says, the Rabbanan always say what they say, end of story, goodbye, it's all the same. Says the Gemara, how do you know? This is quintessential Gemara. How do you know that what they said here applies here? What tells you that? So we have to start, I use the word kvetching, we have to start thinking, is there can we split this hair and say, no, of course you can't. And by the way, lahavdil, this is what legal thinking is about, because when you have a case and you say that case should be controlling on everything you do, comes the other side and say, not so fast. You can't take a precedent from one case and say it automatically applies to another case. The other case is different. And once you have one different, you've wedged up a whole difference between the two, then you see, what are you talking about? Rav Shimon Gamliel doesn't say that here, only over there. This is how the Gemara is now making us think that they're close enough, but not the same, that is the halacha the same, or is the halacha not the same? And that's the question right now where we sit, is we don't know. We don't know. So the Gemara is going to have to give us some kind of an answer here, whether Rav Shimon Gamliel is consistent in all of this or not, and whether the Rabbanan are consistent in all or not. That's again, the beauty of the Gemara is that by giving us that brisa, which has somewhat of a different outcome, we're trying to figure out whether or not that Rav Gamliel is consistent in both cases, or whether he's doing a 180 degree. We don't know that yet. So that's what Rashi is telling us. You know what? They're different. One of them is total destruction, and in the case of Shavui, it's not total destruction, or maybe not. Maybe it's because of Rav Kana's and Rav Nachman's reason why the rabbis say that. But if you don't have a Rav Kana to rein you in, or Rav Nachman by Yitzchak, of course they agree, Rabbanan, that you can sell it. Why not? Why shouldn't you sell it? There's no ulterior motive of Kav Shelo or Tumas and Masas. And the only reason why you couldn't is because of those reasons. So again, this is a classic case where the Gemara is opening us up to understanding the two different things, a Mishnah here, a Brisa here. Are they the same? Are they not the same? And everything that everybody, David, that you said, and David, what you said, that's all valid. And those are all good kashas. So we don't know the answer. So now the Gemara is going to try to wrap this up for us, but and tell us the following. So I would say this is example maybe where the kasha is more satisfying than the answer. So listen to the answer, right? So Zok the Gemara lememra trei tamaninu. You want to distinguish between the two. Are you going to tell me that there are two underlying reasons, one for our Mishnah and one for our Brisa? In other words, there isn't one reason to sell or not to sell, in which case you would not have a machlokes. But remember the trei tamaninu. There are two different reasons, one in the Mishnah, one in the Brisa, right? What would be the two reasons? So we can extrapolate the trei tamaninu, says Rashi, Mishnah Seinu v'nitzei shavui are different. The ikar de islay mocher and peris ogden v'leslay moridin. And in one case, there is a presumption that you want to sell the peris. Why? Because they are, for the reasons that we gave, because of major loss or in the case of the Rabbanan, you can't sell because of, let's say, Rav Kana's reason, but leslay moridin, and you don't go in. But in the other case, you do go in and you do protect, right? So in other words, those are two different and distinct reasons, one for the Mishnah and one for the Brisa. So that might be what you would think is the answer, right? And we say that, so in the case of the Mishnah, the Tanakhama says, no, you know what? You don't go in to protect, because there, so Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, in other words, the Rabbanan take the position that you don't protect because we're not worried about the property, right? Because Rav Kana's reason or Rav Nachman's reason overrules the principle of the destruction of the property. Those are powerful answers according to Tanakhama. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, those aren't powerful answers. It's more important Hashavas Aveda than Rav Kana's reason, for instance. But in the case of Shavui, where the Havamina is that it will not be totally destroyed. That's the Havamina, that we're not going to have total destruction. In that case, okay, if you don't have total destruction, then you have a different reason for either going in or not. They're not the same. That's what the Gemara is saying here. Trei tamaninu, one reason for the Mishnah and one reason for the Brisa. But wait a minute, says the Gemara. No, you can't have trei tama. For Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, we're up to the wide line. Halacha Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. The halacha is like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, which is what? That you sell, that you protect. Amar Shmuel moridin karav l'nichse shavui. Lav mishum chad tamahu. In other words, we see from Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel that there aren't two reasons. There is a consistency to the pattern. In the case of the Mishnah, we say the halacha is like Reb Shimon that you Gamliel that you protect. But in the case of so if you protect, that Amar Shmuel moridin karav l'nichse shavui. But that you do allow a and that's why, according to Shimon Gamliel, you allow a karav to come in. Just like you say, we sell the property to protect it from major damage. Also, we say that the halacha is like Shimon Gamliel, that even if it's potentially spoiled, because remember the case of the Brisa, we're not talking about major spoilage. So you would think, oh, it's not major spoilage. Maybe Shimon Gamliel says you don't touch it. No. Says Shmuel, you allow him to come into the property, the karav, or wherever it is. So don't you see consistency here? So you want to tell me that there's not consistency, possibly it's not consistency, and therefore we can't bring a raya. No, we see consistency. And if we see consistency, then we would have to say the Rabbanan also consistent. Just like in the Mishnah, you may not enter because of Rav Kana's reason or Rav Nachman's reason. So too in the case of the Brisa, you may also not enter because the produce, the owner is not going to worry about having his produce being destroyed. So in which case, you're not allowed to let, according to the Rabbanan, you're not allowed to let a korov into the property. So again, we see from the language of the Gemara that there is consistency, and you can't justify saying the rabbis will allow a korov because you see Rav Shimon Gamliel, in the name of Rav Shimon Gamliel, it said, no, that there isn't that possibility of changing the from one to the other.
So can I ask a question, Rabbi?
Yeah, go ahead, Jay.
So we have this case, we're talking about somebody designated to watch the field, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Now, suppose he decides, I don't hold away, all of these arguments. I'm just going to ignore it. It's tough. The owner should have told me something more specific. But the neighbors watching this, the neighbor who's not involved in the case, can the neighbor come in and do something to make sure the damage is not as great as it would be? Let's say there are some techniques he can do himself with his tractor and his plow. He can do something and override the shomer who's not doing anything.
So in other words, a little bit of self-help here. The neighbor
Yeah,
says,
can
"I
a
want to be a
can a
good
neighbor
Samaritan."
step in?
Yeah, step in. So,
It's like a Shavuos Aveda for the neighbor.
right, right. So I think we have to understand the precepts of the time where people followed the halacha of Bezdin. In other words, the Bezdin was the one who made these decisions. You can always say someone can jump in and do self-help, but I think the Gemara is telling us inherently that people will not do things without permission of the Bezdin. A person is not going to sort of, like you point out, yeah, he's my neighbor, I want to help him. No. We got to go to Bezdin and get the Rishus of Bezdin. So if you have to get Rishus of Bezdin, then you really have to come before Bezdin and say, my neighbor Shimon has a property. I know he's in captivity. I know he's not coming back anytime soon. I'd like to come in and help. And the Bezdin says, don't interfere. We have a process. The process is we have a Karev, and that Karev is first in line to help. So let the Karev do his thing, and you don't jump in. I mean, the argument for jumping in without permission is out there. But I think the Gemara is telling us that that's not the way people proceeded. They proceeded in a more orderly fashion, and they went to Bezdin. And Bezdin, and we saw that from the Mishnah too, because the Mishnah, if you go back to Lamed Chesem and Aleph, the Mishnah says, Lo yiga behem, what does it say? Lo yiga lemochram, the Tamim Parsha Gemara. So in other words, the Gemara, which we're now learning, will explain why lo yiga behem. So and we said that the Bezdin has a role. The Bezdin has a role in all of this. Otherwise, it's like the Wild West. I mean, everybody does what he wants. So we say no. But we're not saying it's the Wild West. We're saying that you go to Bezdin and you say to Bezdin, take a look at this land. This land is being overgrown with weeds. And we know that this fellow went overseas, or we know that he's been arrested and he's not coming back anytime soon. Do we allow this just to go on without any control? So we're saying that in the case of the Shavui, the Bezdin will say, don't interfere, it's under control. We have a Karev, and that Karev is going to go ahead. And again, the Gemaras that we're going to do next week will be much more elaborate on the story of this Karev, whether or not this Karev is a legitimate guy or not a legitimate guy. It's not so simple. Oh, he's a Karev, he'll help, and everything's good. Not so fast. But for our purposes here, David, as you point out, the question becomes whether or not there is a consistent reason for allowing someone in. And according to Shimon Gamliel, there is, which means it doesn't matter if it is a big loss in the land or a small loss in the land. Our Mishnah talks about a major loss of produce. Of course, you let him in. The case of the Brisa with the captive, there isn't a major loss going on here, and that's why there's a machlokes. Tanakama says no major loss, leave it alone. Shimon Gamliel says doesn't matter to me. Major, minor, a loss is a loss, and therefore it's chatamahu. And you allow him in. So, and that's the essence of the machlokes, is that there was consistency in the opinions of Rav Shimon Gamliel or the Tanakh and the Tanakama. When there's a loss, there's a loss. When there's not a loss, it doesn't matter. So that's how the Gemara wants to express, because it says, why does it say that? Because Rav Shimon, Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel that the halachas of Shimon Gamliel, And he also says, okay, so we know the halakha is like Rav Shimon Gamliel, therefore in our Mishnah you can intervene. What about the case of the Shavui? Shmuel, and in the case of the Shavui, Shmuel says, Morid and Karov Shavui. You are allowed to let a Karov in. Why does he have to say that? Because you have a Havamina that in that case, there's a different rules apply. The rules of Rav Shimon Gamliel don't apply because there's no major loss. So maybe Rav Shimon Gamliel will say, leave it alone. There's no major loss. I'm not worried about a Shabbos Aveda.
So how does this,
Does Shmuel know that even in the case of minimal loss, you have to allow him in?
so how does this flow down to today? We don't have a business to go ask questions. You have a neighbor and something's going on with the property and, you know, he's not around or this and that. I didn't ask you to do anything. To what extent are you allowed to go in and save him money by doing something so he won't have a loss without any permission?
Okay, so again, so for today, we're going to have to look at the halacha, we look at the Mishnah Brura, we look at the Poskim as to what they say. But in principle, this Gemara is telling us, follow Rab Shimon ben Gamliel. Rab Shimon Gamliel is the better approach, that you always take the position that you have to be Hashavas Aveda to the next guy. So if we're going to look it up, which we will, and we'll look at what the Mishnah Brura says, or what the Kitzur says, or what Rav Moshe said, or what the practical halacha is, I think we're going to find that Rab Shimon Gamliel's shita is the overriding shita, that each of us have an obligation to make sure that. And today, you're right, we don't have a Bezdin. So someone is out in Timbuktu and he's watching this. And so if he's a from guy and he says, wait a minute, I know someone so-and-so owns this property. I'm not going to turn a blind eye and say I'm just going to let it rot away. No, do something, and I'm going to intervene and try to again do this mitzvah Shos Aveda of protecting the property. That presumably is the halacha, and we'll check. But for purposes of the Gemara, since the Gemara is saying Rav Shimon Gamliel is naturally the paisik that everybody follows, it follows because it's normal. It's normal for a yid to want to help another yid.
Yeah,
Rabbi,
Right?
Rabbi, can you clarify something for me?
Yeah.
When we went back to the earlier Mishnah and Gemara discussion about a shomer, an unpaid
Right.
shomer.
Right.
The decision was that the shomer couldn't do anything. Even if I recall correctly, even if it was over a minimal amount of spoilage or damage,
Right.
he couldn't step in and do anything.
According to the Rabbanan, only according to the Rabbanan. That wasn't universally accepted. The Rabbanan were the one who said, even if there's major damage, you may not intervene because of the reasons that we gave of Rotza Kab Shalo, a person wants his own rather than someone else's, or the Truma or Maser issue. In other words, there were reasons why, Michael, we didn't allow him to take matters into his own hands because of those extraneous matters. The Truma or Maser matter was very serious, because if the owner was going to give Truma or Maser from this produce and you undercut him by selling it so that he shouldn't have a loss, then you're going to make a bigger problem. You're going to create tevel, and someone is going to eat tevel because there was never truma or maser taken. That was our problem there.
So this Mishnah is only related to the land itself, not to the produce from the land?
To the land itself.
The current Mishnah.
The Mishnah that we're learning here,
Right.
I think it says that you can't, when the land is deteriorating and the produce is rotting in the field, according to the rabbis, according to Tanakama, you may not do anything because you're going to jeopardize the balance. I call it the balance of nature.
Right.
You're going to jeopardize the balance that you're going to. In other words, every event has consequences. You want to save his property, but you're going to wind up selling his property, and then he's going to give Truma and Maser from something that he doesn't have, and everything will be Tevel. So you see that good deed went punished because someone is eating Tevel down the road because you wanted to save his property. Says the rabbis, don't touch. Don't.
But I didn't. I don't remember Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel's Shita
No,
counteracting
Rabbi
that.
Shimon Gamliel was the exact opposite. He said,
Right.
I'm not worried about Truma Masa. I want to protect the owner. To me, Shabbos Aveda is number one, and that's what we're discussing here today in the Rabbi Shimon
Okay, so
Gamliel
that
version.
applies back there too, even though.
Exactly.
Okay,
Exactly.
and we're going to learn, I guess, that the halacha is Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel.
That's correct. Right. So we're analyzing Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, and he doesn't take the position that I'm worried about the Truma Amasa issue or the Kav Shalo issue. That's why he takes the position. No, you've got to immediately jump in and salvage this property,
Right.
because the Shabbos Aveda is of the utmost importance.
Right.
And again,
Okay, thank you.
that's the back and forth. Who do we paskin like? So the Gemara told us that whenever Rabbi Shimon Gamliel weighs in, it's Rav Shimon Gamliel, except for those exceptions which don't apply here. So if that's the case, then Hashavas Haveda trumps the issue of Truma Masa, right? That's what we're trying to say. So,
Right.
so just to complete
Thank you.
this Gemara, we're saying that you see the Chatamahu, that they are one and the same reason. And for the Gemara low, Trey Tamaninu. There's two underlying reasons for doing what we're doing. One in our Mishnah, one in our Brisa. Hachinami mistabra, and we say that's logical. Why is it logical? The Amar Rava, Rav Nachman, because Rava says in the name of Rav Nachman, halacha kedivrei chachamim, that the halacha is like the chachamim, that you do not intervene. Amar Rav Nachman marit karov l'nichsei shavui, but you do allow a karov into the nichsei shavui. So according to Rav Nachman, not Rabbi Yochanan, but according to Rav Nachman, those two things are contradictory. If you hold halacha kedivrei chachamim, that the halacha is like the rabbis, that you may not enter, then by rights you should not appoint a karov l'nichsei shavui, because there's one reason and one reason only, and that is don't intervene. But we see that Rav Nachman says halacha kedivrei chachamim. In the case of our Mishnah, it's like the rabbis, that you don't intervene. And that same Rav Nachman says morid and karov l'nichsei shavui, that you do allow a karov into the possession of into the property of the captive. But wait a minute, that's a stira. So the Gemara wants to conclude that since Rav Nachman takes the opposing view, that in our Mishnah we hold like the Chachamim, but in the case of Shavui, we do allow someone in, which are two opposing positions. That shows that the underlying reason is not one and the same. It's not the same time to protect. Because in the case of the Shavui, in the case of the Mishnah, I'm really worried about Truma and Maser, Michael. I'm really worried about the possibility of Tevel. I'm really worried about the possibility that a person is going to say, I don't want someone else's produce. I want my produce. And that's an overriding reason not to intervene. But in the case of the Shavui, where those things don't matter, there's no Truma Maser issue. There's nothing of that at all. In that case, the Chacham are going to be lenient, and they're going to say, you know what? Let's appoint a karov who has a vested interest in the property and make sure that nothing happens. It's contradictory to the Mishnah. That's because there's two differing reasons. The Mishnah has one reason for doing what it does, and the Brisa has another reason. So the Gemara wants to conclude that because we see that it's not uniform. Yes, according to Rav Shimon Gamliel, it's uniform. Just like you intervene in one, you can intervene in the other. But you see that according to Rav Nachman, there's a reason not to intervene in our Mishnah because of these reasons, Truma Maser, etc. But there is a reason to intervene in the case of the captive, because there, in that particular case, the overriding reasons don't apply. So depending on how you look at this Gemara, I mean, the Gemara is saying that the halacha is Shema Mino, there are two reasons. But if you were Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, you wouldn't agree. You would say there's only one reason, and that reason is to protect property. So just like I protect property in our Mishnah because of Shabbos Haveda, I protect property in the case of the Shavui because I don't want any destruction. But if you take the position of Rav Nachman, who comes along and says, no, the halacha is kedivrei chachamim, opposing Rav Shimon Gamliel. He says the halacha is kedivrei chachamim. Therefore, in the Mishnah, you may not intervene, but in the case of the Brisa, you may intervene. So let's take a quick look. Rashi says, do we have Rashman?
Rabbi, just a brief
Yeah.
thought. When you say that if he's got produce in the field, that produce, even though it'll spoil this year, well, two things. One, there's really no such thing as a spoiling because it could always be used for something, if it's for fodder or for fertilizing or whatever it is. They can always use that. But if the produce, let's say they grew tomatoes, just as an example, or something that has seeds, if it just goes dormant and it dies, it goes back into the ground and it reseeds itself for next year. So he's not really losing a full crop if it's seeded.
That's
I don't know wheat. I don't know the wheats or anything, but I know anything with seeds because it's happened on my place.
So that's a very valid and interesting point, David, that you make, that by not doing anything, it will not harm the property as much because that lying fallow will encourage maybe better growth in the next year. You're 100% right. But the focus of our Gemara is right now, he has a loss of money because he could have taken that crop and sold it or used it or done something with it. So what you're saying is in the long run, it's not so terrible because if you do nothing, the land will get better because everything will sort of spoil into the land, right? That's what you're saying. Now, it'll spoil into the land. So what's the big deal? And in a sense, you're right. But our Gemara is not dealing with next year. Our Gemara is saying right now, when you see crop that is spoiling, that's a loss of money because that crop could have been harvested and it could have been sold and you could have helped pay or give sustenance to the family of the captive who is living there. After all, they need sustenance. If you say don't touch it, that means they lose a whole year of produce, which could have been income to them. So your point is absolutely correct when you take the long view. In the long view, what's so terrible? The land will fold into itself. The land will get better, so to speak, because it'll like Shvius. What does the Baruch tell us about Shvius? Why do we have Shvius? We're going to lose a year of income. The farmer is going to lose a year of income. The Torah says that this thing called Shvius, right, is supposed to help the land and ultimately help the owner because he'll have better and more produce down the road. That's the whole theory behind it. Right. But in the moment now, today, this year, he's lost money. How is his family going to survive? He has, let's say, a wife and children or people who are dependent on that produce going to market and being sold. They're not doing that now.
So the wife can't make a decision if the husband's not there, she doesn't have the authority to make a decision.
Okay, I mean, all right. I use the wife and children. It's a bad example because yes.
No, but if we're talking about a family, well, doesn't the family members have a right to make a decision? Listen, our dad is not there, or our father, or our provider, or whatever.
Right.
We have to survive.
It's a bad example because you're right. If there's other people connected to the land, they can make a decision. So we're talking about a piece of land where there is no one to make a decision. I'll take it back. There's no one to make a decision. He owns a piece of land. No one can say anything about that land because there is nobody. Comes the Beis Din and says, now what are we going to do? So are we going to allow someone to intervene in order for this person, this captive, not to have a complete loss? Because after all, he does own the property, or maybe he just went overseas. Or are we going to say, no, we may not touch it, and therefore he has to take a complete loss? Your point then being, but is it really a complete loss? Because the fact that no one does anything this year could potentially mean that there's a better crop next year because the land has gone fallow a year. But
This
since
is
the
a totally
focus,
different scenario though, because if there's nobody there that's gonna lose from it, only the person who's gone, he's not there. They're really.
no, but the Bezin wants to protect his interest too. But the Bezin doesn't want to say just because he's not there means he should lose out. So therefore, we're asking the question: can the Bezin intervene to help this fellow so that he shouldn't lose everything this year? Again, if you're going to balance this year versus the future, as the Gemara will say, maybe in the future there's a valid reason for him not to cultivate the land. But we're only looking at this year, right now. The fact that the produce is going to get spoiled will mean that he will have a monetary loss, because let's say he comes back in 3 months or 4 months and no one has tended the field and it's beyond repair. He's lost a year cycle worth of produce, and that's not right. So according to the Chachamim, again, they're admitting that there's two different reasons. According to Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, there's one reason: always save the land. That's fine. But the chiddush is that the Chachamim are telling us that in the case of our Mishnah, where we have intervening reasons not to sell, Trumas and Masras, as an example, don't sell. But the rabbis would say, well, you have no reason not to sell, because there's no Truma Masa Isher or Kav Shalo, then of course you sell. So we had a Havamina that the rabbis would say that one size fits all, you can't sell, you can never sell. Comes the Gemara and tells us no, that the rabbis would admit in the case of the Brisa, where there is no reasonable reason why he shouldn't sell, that he's allowed to sell. Rabbi Gamliel says that all the time, so he's Lishitasa. But the Gemara wants to tell us that if you thought there was one reason, and therefore the rabbis don't allow one or the other, comes Rav Nachman and says, no, in the case of our Mishnah, you may not sell because of Trumas and Masras or Kav Shalo. But in the case where Truma and Masra doesn't play a role, as in the case of the Brisa, Shavui, therefore we have a different opinion and we allow him to sell. So in point of fact, and we'll look at the halacha, is it could well be that everybody agrees where we are today, before we have a further discussion, that in the case where there's minimal loss to the property, and we can salvage the rest of the property for the person who is in captivity or went to Medina Sayyam, then we should sell, because there's no reason to hold us back. The only reason to hold us back was the Mishnah, which said, I've got to worry about Trumas and Masras or other things. There is a legitimate machlokes between the Tanakama and Rav Shimon Gamliel, but in the case of the Brisa, there isn't a legitimate machlokes, because everybody can be of the opinion that we should sell, because there's no, in other words, you can only help him. So even though Rav Shimon Gamliel says Hashabbos Aved and the Chachamim don't, but the Chachamim have no reason not to. And Rav Nachman echoes that by saying, in the name of Shmuel, that even the Chachamim who hold you may not sell, in the case of our Mishnah by Hamafkid, you may not sell. They agree that you may sell in the case of the Brisa, because they're either they admit to Rav Shimon Gamliel or say there's no intervening reason not to sell. So where we are today is that we've kind of come together, and we've said that there's a machlokes between the Tanakama of Gamliel and our Mishnah, but not a machlokes in the Brisa. Everybody agrees that you can't sell. Mitzvah next week, when we go further, we're going to start seeing distinguishing reasons why maybe that should not be the case. And in the meantime, we're going to take a look at the halacha, beferish, just to see whether or not the halacha today answers any of these questions, as Jay posed or everybody else, is what's the practical halacha. We know what the Gemara's halacha is, but what's the actual practical halacha today? Do we hold up with Shimon Gamliel?
Sky.
Right?
Thank you.
So again,
Thank you.
this is real, what we're learning now is real world stuff, because this has a very practical effect on us today. even though we're not in an agrarian society, but for instance, in Eretz Yisrael, these questions can come up maybe all the time, since it is more agrarian, is how do people treat each other's land? What should you do? Do you have reshus? Do you not have reshus? I mean, there are courts, there are Batei Dinim today. The question is, do those Batei Dinim have power to be able to, to give halachic interpretation to whether or not someone should do something or just hands off, don't touch. So anyway, even though this is Talmud Bavli, which was really referring to Golos, still we have valid reasons to look at this and understand what the halacha is. Again, maybe in Eretz Yisrael, but also today, if you're living somewhere in Nebraska or Kansas and you have a farm and a Yid has a farm next to you, what's the halacha? Am I allowed to go into his property and help him? Should I not help him? What should I do? So we're all big city kids, so we don't really focus on this, but this is a very valid question on halacha.
If